Welcome to Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. Since 1957, robotic space probes have visited all the planets in the solar system. Is it the case that they have found mostly uninteresting collections of gas, rocks, ice and dust? Has any evidence of past or present life in the solar system ever been discovered? Today we are going to discuss some of the anomalies that have been found. Could it be the case that taxpayer-funded space agencies have ignored or even lied about these anomalies and their significance? What would happen if NASA or European Space Agency scientists had discovered compelling evidence of past or present extraterrestrial life in our solar system? Would they tell us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about such a discovery? Or would the scientific technological elite mentioned in Eisenhower's final address to the USA in 1961 become gatekeepers of secrets in the solar system? Here to discuss his book, Secrets in the Solar System, welcome back, Andrew Johnson.
Thanks, Richard, for that great introduction there.
Which I just read off the back of your book.
Well, that's why it's so good.
Okay, Andrew. Now, you mentioned there space probes, and I know there are some people who will say, oh, well, none of those probes even went there. Can we make a quick comment on that first?
Yeah, I think you've got to do your own research again, and also that doesn't just involve internet research. I recommend that anybody who's interested joins a local astronomical society and starts to look at some of these objects for themselves. And the way I look at this is certain observations you can verify for yourself. You can look at the moon through a telescope, so you can see certain details which you can then begin to compare at least, with what's shown by the space probes. Same goes for Mars, because Mars is close enough to us that we can actually look through a telescope and observe certain features of that. And you can even, for example, now do what's called, you can photograph it with a webcam or a better camera and do image stacking, take your own photographs of Mars if you get the right equipment. Same thing with Jupiter. You can see the features of Jupiter through a decent telescope. You might spend a few £100, but to me, if you really want to know the truth, that's what you should be doing your own research. See, as far as possible, you want to be seeing things with your own eyes.
Yes, absolutely. Now, we have questioned certain missions on this program, right? But I think it's fair to say that there's good evidence why we think they've not been honest with certain missions. So I've spent time looking at the Mars rover missions. You've spent a lot of time looking at the Apollo missions. And the reason why you spent time on Apollo and I spent time on the Mars rover missions is because we saw evidence that they were not being honest with the data, let's put it that way. But generally speaking, 90% of missions we think are probably they're being honest about.
I mean, I think in the main, yes, but this is where you've got to really focus down on the research and try and come to some conclusions. You do get into some sticky areas, and some people, of course, will say, well, once we've uncovered evidence that NASA have faked the moon landings, and I'm sort of 99% sure that that is the case, that they didn't go there, then you can throw out all the other NASA data as well. And people have said that to me in emails and stuff, and you hear it in various YouTube videos. But I don't think it's as simple as that. No. As I said, we can verify some of the observations for ourselves. And I think you and I have had conversations as well regarding the difference between the orbiter missions and the landing missions. And I think, to me, I think it's a lot easier to send a craft into orbit around a planet than it is to land it safely and do a soft landing on the surface. I think from an engineering point of view, it's a much simpler thing to actually put it in orbit around the planet, and therefore logistically, if you want to say, oh yeah, they're all fake, well, I think there's much more chance of the orbiters being genuine than there is of the landers being genuine.
Yeah, and in a recent previous lecture, I did try and shed light on this knotty area, which is, well, what's real and what's fake. So people can go back and watch that lecture. And in that lecture, I gave what I think is a very plausible reason why the Apollo missions were hoaxed. and that's to do with the reliability of the craft. If you look at all of the unmanned missions and compare the reliabilities in the table that I set out, I think that provides a good a motive why they did that. They didn't want to kill 3 astronauts by trying to send them to the moon, and they'd already said that they were going to do it, so they had to hoax it. But
Yes.
we do think that many of the missions, especially the unmanned missions, are real, although they've perhaps hoaxed elements of them.
Yes, that's my conclusion, is that the missions themselves are real. I would say from everything I've looked at that orbiters did indeed go around and orbit the planets, but some of the data that's come back has definitely been massaged, and things have been airbrushed, and I've got 1 or 2 examples of that in the book, that you can actually, where they've said that, for example, there's one in one of the later chapters where it's to do with the Cassini probe, which is the probe which went round Saturn, and they admitted that they airbrushed one of the images from that because they were trying to achieve a particular effect where they had 2 of the moons which were in the same shot, but because of the speed that the spacecraft was travelling, aesthetically the shot that they got wasn't very good. So what they did was they combined 2 shots and then they photoshopped out the background. And you can actually see this if you go to they have this website called Astronomy Picture of the Day where they publish, a Hubble image or an image from one of the rovers or something. And it's an interesting website if you're interested in astronomy, which is of course what I am. And they actually have this Cassini image, and you can go into that, that archive and download that image and then run it into your favourite image editing program, turn up the contrast in the image, and you can see the Photoshop, brush marks clearly. I show that in the book, and I think anyone who looks into this will find that yes, they admit that they do doctor the images. The Hubble doctors the images, so the images that you see of these wonderful sort of galaxies and colours, that is fake. That part is essentially fake, but they admit they tell you they do that, and it's to bring out the features that are there. It's a bit like when we contrast enhance a picture to make a detail come out because we're trying to make the picture look better, and that's what NASA are doing in that regard. But obviously they're not just doing that. They're not just enhancing or changing pictures for aesthetic reasons. There are other reasons too, which of course we're going to talk about.
Yes. All right, so if we just consider, because you and I firmly believe they've lied about certain things, what is it that they state they were trying to do in the first place? What was the point of these space missions that they have declared?
Well, in many cases, I think it's exclusively for all of the probes, but it's to look for evidence of life on other planets. That's particularly with Mars, of course. You just listen to the mission goals, and read the mission goals on some of the missions. It's to look for evidence of life on Mars. It's to look, and also look for evidence of water, which we'll get to. Yeah. And again, we've covered some of this on previous Rich Planet programs, but we're just going to sort of cover some things in a bit more depth that we haven't covered before.
Yeah, and I like to contrast the amount of cheering and clapping and back patting after they landed Curiosity on Mars compared to the amount of non-cheering and clapping and back patting when they found a crinoid fossil on Mars. They found complex life on Mars. This thing that swims around the ocean, right? And they didn't have a party,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So from that, that's not their motivation, or maybe it started out as that. Do you think?
It's more. I think it's more complicated, and I think certainly, we talked about the rovers being fake, and if that crinoid fossil, for example, was in a desert somewhere, then maybe that's why they didn't celebrate it because.
Yeah. Of course, I'm playing devil's advocate there. But
but I think some of the other stuff we're going to talk about, and again, we've mentioned some of this on previous programs, but there's 1 or 2 things that I discovered while I was writing the book, which I think, make you realise that this whole idea of discovering life and the way they're managing that is more complicated.
To me, it seems like they made that as a statement at the start to justify the missions.
Yes. And
when they started to find things, they kept it for themselves and then had to massage data in order to keep it to themselves.
Yeah.
You think?
Yeah.
All right, then, so you mentioned orbiters, and you believe that all of the planets and some of the moons have had orbiters successfully launched,
Yes.
and are in orbit today around various...
Many of them, yeah, that have still got power, yes, yeah.
So we'll talk about the lunar orbiters first.
Yes.
And we're going to look at some images. So you're convinced enough that these images are genuine, Andrew?
Yes, yes. And I mean, some of them, you can actually pick up with a good Earth-based telescope. And I think we had, I think the first on the list was the Aristarchus crater, wasn't it?
Yes, the Aristarchus crater.
So the Aristarchus crater, on the face of it, looks fairly straightforward as a crater. It is a round crater, but it does have an unusual bottom on it, and there are some other unusual features. And why I particularly found this interesting as well is that if you look at some of the historical records and you look into what are called TLP, transient lunar phenomena, there's a whole report by NASA which was done in, I think, 1967, and they actually catalogued a whole range of these lunar phenomena which they were looking at through history, and Patrick Moore contributed to this report. And the NASA catalogue, it lists 579 observations from the period 1540 to 1967 of unusual things that have been seen on the moon or near the moon or coming up out of craters. You know, clouds of gas, small white cloud, a nebulous appearance, a white spot that was only there for a period of time. William Herschel had described seeing volcanoes in 1787, and quite a number of these anomalies are actually in the Aristarchus crater. Now, these, of course, are people that have reported these with a telescope, not with space probes, hundreds of years ago. So, what's going on in the Aristarchus crater? Is it still some type of active volcano of some kind, or is it, some type of entrance into the moon? Because some people think that the moon is a giant spaceship, and John Lear says there's bases there and so forth. I don't know about that much, but certainly the Aristarchus crater has enough that's been reported about it over the years that it doesn't seem to me, if you study that it's just a cold, dead world with nothing going on.
So if you're going to make some observations, Andrew, and video them with a telescope, you think that would be a good...
The Aristarchus might be a good place to look at if you've got the patience to do it, but I mean, you might be doing this for months and months and months, and people, I'm sure, will write in and say, oh, have you seen the Crow 777 videos of the moon? That's one thing I didn't really put in the book, but he's done that. He's done just what you suggest, that he's got a telescope hooked up to a high-resolution video camera, and he's run it for weeks and weeks, and he does lots of YouTube videos, and he has picked up some interesting stuff. I don't know about transient lunar phenomena, but he's definitely picked up a couple of UFOs going across the surface of the moon. But whether they're as far away as the moon, because the moon's a long way off, it's 250-odd thousand miles. So any object that you pick up in a telescope, 250,000 miles away, it's going to be pretty big, isn't it? Yeah. So, so the Crow 777 objects, I think, may be a bit closer to the Earth than what we're seeing on the moon. But yeah, Aristarchus crater, if you've got a telescope and you want to do a time-lapse photography of it or something, you never know, you might pick up some interesting things.
All right, you mentioned theories of the moon being hollow. There's a book, Who Built the Moon? What's your opinion on those theories?
Well, my opinion basically is I don't know. I don't know whether the moon is a constructed object or whether it is just a natural object, or maybe it was hollowed out by some civilization and it just looks like a moon. Certainly, the observations that are made that in relation to the size of the parent planet, the moon is the biggest. I think it's one of the biggest in the solar system. It's only comparable with Pluto in terms of the percentage that the size of the satellite is to the main body. Mm-hmm. Pluto has a very big satellite as well, but the Earth, I think, is the second in terms of the proportion of sizes of the satellite to the main body. So that's unusual. The other thing, of course, that comes up is eclipses, where people say, well, isn't it a coincidence that the moon is 400 times smaller than the sun, but it's 400 times nearer? So that surely means it's, been put there. Mm-hmm. But not necessarily, because being anal about it, some eclipses aren't a total eclipse. Some of them are what are called annular eclipses. So the moon is slightly further away and smaller, and you can see a ring around the sun. So we don't always get the perfect,
Right.
alignments, as it were.
Right.
So a summary of that really is, I don't know whether the moon is a constructed thing. I haven't ruled it out. I just haven't seen anything, what I would call slam dunk evidence myself.
Right. And just to pick up a point on craters, this is something which Adrian Gilbert mentioned when we were discussing electric universe. And when it dawns on you, you think, why didn't I think of that? And that is that all of the craters are almost circular. They're very close to perfect circles. And if things that are crashing into it are crashing into the moon randomly, then the chances of getting a perfectly circular crater are very small. They should be mostly elliptical, glancing off, all right? And the electric universe lobby put forward the argument that craters on the surface of the moon were all made due to electric discharge, i.e. massive lightning strike, right, which would create a perfect circular crater and would always be perpendicular to the surface. So you'd always get a round craters. If you've got two charged spheres and you're going to get electric discharge between one and the other, it's going to make a circular impact on it because it's acting perpendicular. And why didn't I think of that? Do you go along with that, Andrew?
Yeah, I think I have some sympathy with that view, but I think also if you look in my book, there is actually an elliptical crater, and I'd not seen this before. I picked it up while I was looking at some of the images from the lunar orbiter probes, and I've got it on page 15 and 16. You do actually have an elliptical crater which has a sort of an unusual streak in the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
But it's true though, you would expect that more variation in the shapes of craters. But I think if you say that all craters were formed by electrical discharge, then we do know that rocks from space hit the moon. But that was observed, I think, in the 12th century, the formation of a new crater. And we've seen it. We've seen rocks come to. We've got meteor crater on the Earth, for example, in Arizona, and that appears to be an impact crater. So I think it's more. We can't just say it's one thing or the other necessarily. I think we've got.
So there might be a number of circular craters that are due to electric discharge rather than an actual physical body.
Yes, potentially. Yeah.
But that's not really acknowledged, is it?
No, it isn't. They don't go in for the electrical discharge phenomena. But we may talk a bit more about that because that's been brought up to me several times on Mars as well. So we'll talk about that a bit later.
So have you mentioned the Vitello crater?
The Vitello crater, I've put that in the book. And this was something, again, which I'd heard about. I think John Lear's got something about there being unusual things going on in the Vitello crater. Again, either strange lights or UFOs coming up and this sort of thing that people have spoken about. And I've got a picture of this, again, from one of the 1960s lunar orbiter probes. And again, you can get this book free. PDF download is free, or you can get it from Rich Planet as a paperback. And you get all the image references in there. You can go on to the various websites, find the original images, download them, check them yourself. That's what I encourage people to do. It's all referenced at the end with the hyperlinks and everything. But the thing that's unusual about a Vitello crater is it almost looks like it's got a racetrack in it, or it's got something going on with tracks in the bottom. The crater isn't circular. It's sort of a roughly circular shape, but it looks almost like, the circle you might get when you make a pancake or something like that, with bits sticking out at one side. It's asymmetric. But you'll see that we'll put an image of that up on the screen, hopefully, so you can see that. So again, I didn't write a lot about that. It's just, this is unusual. It doesn't look like a straightforward impact crater. It's got these weird traces on the bottom, and I don't know what they are. That I couldn't, right. And I haven't seen an explanation for what they are either. So that was basically it for that.
Right, and the Vitello crater appears to have boulders in it that have rolled and left a trail in them.
That's right.
Should we be surprised at that? Is the gravity not enough to cause things to roll down the slopes of craters?
Well, this was. I think it was in that. If you zoom into part of the Vitello crater, yes, I'd forgotten about that. You've got these boulders. And as you say, that they do appear to show evidence of rolling. And there was one particular image that we were going to mention that was in this George Leonard book, Who is on Our Moon. Plate 14 in George Leonard's book and it's discussed on page 96 of his book, and it looks like this weird thing, and he claims that this boulder has rolled up out of a crater, and I don't know quite how he came to that conclusion, but I actually managed to find the lunar reconnaissance orbiter image of this same place, and you can actually see much more clearly that this is indeed a large boulder. It's not anything. It's not a monolith. There was talk of it being a monolith, but if you look on page, if you look on the page of my book, page 25, you'll see that there's a lunar reconnaissance orbiter of this image. And again, of course, people are going to criticise me and say, "Oh, well, you're assuming that this image is genuine." And the one that they took of the Apollo landing site is doctored, and I'm saying yes, I do conclude that for the reasons that we've discussed before. But this very clearly looks like a rock, and it matches the George Leonard image. And then I discovered in the same area you can see just exactly what look like boulders rolling down a slope. And these are higher resolution images from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which were captured, I think, in 2009 onwards, basically.
Right. So you think he's wrong? You don't think it's rolling up a slope?
No, I think it is what the official explanation, I think in this case, is correct. That these boulders rolling down a slope, and I think if you look at the images and look at several of them as I did, explore, spend your time, spend half an hour looking at the images, I think you'll probably agree with me.
Right. And what about the Blair cuspids?
The Blair cuspids, yes, this was something I came across when I was looking at all these other images that I was trying to find. And these were discovered in I think 1966. And it was a lunar orbiter image, and this lunar orbiter was obviously sent up with a view to looking at landing sites for the supposed manned missions. But William Blair of Boeing Institute of Biotechnology, he actually saw these on one of the pictures. He was looking at them or seen them published, and they seem to form, again we'll put the picture up, like an L shape, you call it an L shape but turned on its side. And there were three bright spots, 3 bright points, as if they'd been placed to show an L shape. And it does look very peculiar because all around this, you've got this random field of impact craters, small, different sizes. But then in the midst of that, you've got this seeming alignment of four boulders. And then somebody else had done a further analysis claiming that there's geometry, so they're aligned geometrically. And if you line them up with other points, there's 3 or 4 other points on the surface, they form equilateral triangles or triangles with particular angles in them. And you can see that, I've highlighted that in the book. And there was quite a good analysis of this, and I can't remember the name of the guy that did it that I came across, but it's in the book.
So what he's doing, he's using geometric mathematical techniques to check for artificiality.
Yeah. He was looking to see what angles there were between, if you drew lines between these points on the surface, again, were there any geometrically significant angles or alignments? And we got some higher resolution images in 2017 from Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. But then I was able to find the highest resolution one in a different place, because there's various places that these images are kept. And if you look at the very highest resolution one that's available, you can actually see, if you zoom into it, that the the alignment in an L is not quite, it's not quite there.
Right. And
you can see that they do look like rocks. I think I zoomed in on one of them, and it looks like a bit you can actually see a bit that's broken off it. And there does seem to be an alignment between 3 of the boulders, kind of. Right. But when you look at it in higher resolution, it seems to me less significant. It's certainly not a perfect alignment. Right. It's just maybe a sort of close alignment.
And you wouldn't be able to see any of that through a telescope then?
No, this is you need to be very close to see this, because these things, we're talking like hundreds of meters between these objects, and with a telescope you're talking like miles and miles and miles, between the objects that you can see on the surface.
All right. What about the Ukert crater? What's significant about that? Yeah,
so the Ukert crater, this, again, just look at it. It's very unusual. It's not circular. It's the Clementine image, which was this military probe, is pretty useless. The one they've published. There is an LRO lunar reconnaissance orbiter image, and that's much clearer. And it's a vaguely triangular shape, not terribly triangular. I don't know, you almost might describe it as getting towards a sort of heart shape, and then it's got this little nodule on the top, the north end of it, as it is here.
And how can you get an image from a Greek observatory, which is far better than the Clementine probe which went there?
That's right. This is the thing. This was extremely strange, and I looked at that Clementine probe image, and it was all darkened off, and you couldn't see much of it.
Well, it's a military mission, wasn't it?
It was.
I'm sure they've got the real photograph somewhere.
Yes, indeed. They must have a much better picture, and the Greek observatory picture is surprisingly good. And I don't think it's a good telescope, but it's not the best. I think this Greek observatory is not. I forget the size of the telescope, but you can go and look it up. But yeah, it's basically a triangular-looking crater. I haven't really studied it more than that. It doesn't look like an impact crater. Is it remnants of an ancient civilization? I don't know. All I'm saying in the book is this is something to look at. You can easily find this image if you want, and it doesn't look like an impact crater to me. And I haven't seen what their explanation is for how it was formed.
Right. And is there any explanation of how you can get a hexagonal crater?
Well, that's it. This is another one. I came across this a few years ago.
Are you certain that this hexagonal one is sunken? It looks like it could be raised.
I'm not certain, actually, Richard, to be quite honest with you. When I looked at it just from a perspective, I assumed it was sunken. And I think it is called, I forget if they give it a name. But there was this particular one was unusual because I spent quite a bit of time. They've got this catalogued on a Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter 3 image from the 60s. LO3143-H3A is the image number. But that seemingly can only be found on one page. It is a space website. It's not a hobbyist website. It's not a blog. It's one of the official space websites.
But that looks to me like it could be raised rather than
just the way you look at it.
Let people email us. What do they think? Does that look like a crater, or does it look like a mound?
It could be a mound. And if anybody's got any more information on it, I'd be grateful to have it, because I spent quite a bit of time looking for what I couldn't find. When I went to the latitude and longitude, which is given for this image, which is latitude 3.3, longitude minus 22.5, that was what was given on the image from the 60s. When I went looking for that on Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, because they've got the whole of the moon mapped by Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, you can basically type in the latitude and longitude and go there, zoom in. This wasn't there. I couldn't see it anywhere. So is that a cover-up? I don't know, but I couldn't find it. If anyone could find, more information on this, I'd be very interested to hear it.
Interesting. Right, we'll move on to the Chandrayaan anomaly.
Chandrayaan anomaly, indeed. That's kind of a similar story to the last one, actually. And you look at it, and I saw this as a mound. It looked like a mound to me of some kind. And it's sort of fairly indistinct. We've only got part of it. We've only got the sort of right-hand side of it. It's got a bit chopped off. Very difficult to say what it is. Again, if you look at the crater field around it, this is incongruous with that. It looks different to what's around it significantly, and it's not like a giant range of hills. It's just like a mound of some kind. But when I found this image, I think back in 2008, 2009, I came across it on a blog, and there was a link to the Indian Space Agency website, which is because, believe it or not, people that didn't know this, the Indians have sent up a probe to the moon. They called it, I think it was Chandrayaan was the name of the probe.
Right.
And this went up. This image was posted, I think, in 2008 originally. And that was in the early part of that mission. 16th November 2008 was when this was posted. But again, going back to look for it, couldn't find it. It seemed to have disappeared. And I tried to go onto their image archive, because they've now got an image archive, because their probe ran for, I don't know if it's still running, but it took certainly hundreds of images, maybe thousands. They went into an archive, and now you've got to get a login. The login is free, but to go through all the image catalogue, you know, you had to get a login and mess around with it, and it used this Java program and downloaded Java to your computer, and it's a real pain. You couldn't just click on a link and get it like the LRO one. It was really painful. So I couldn't find any further images of this Chandrayaan anomaly, this sort of mound or whatever it was. I did find...
Maybe they didn't tell the Indians they were covering that one up.
Maybe not, you know, maybe not. And I did have a good look for this. I did find a lunar reconnaissance orbiter of the same area, but it appears that because of the way the lunar reconnaissance orbiter orbits, it's got a very oblique angle. You can sort of more or less recognise it as the same mound, but it's from an oblique angle, so it's not a very good quality image. It's low resolution, and so you can't really tell what's going on. It's barely discernible, as I've written in the book. So is that a structure? Maybe. Is it just some strange type of hill?
Right.
Maybe.
Now, there are people who claim that there are buildings, there are tanks, there are glass shards that are miles high, and there's a huge smashed glassed dome on the moon. Can you give us your opinion on those, Andrew?
Yes, this has mainly come from Richard Hoagland. I think there's one or two other people that have supported him in that. And he's gone on to claim, for example, that part of the reason why they mind controlled the astronauts was that they'd seen all these artifacts on the moon, you know, alien artifacts potentially, or buildings. And he claims that Edgar Mitchell was looking up at this partly shattered glass dome on the moon, and that's why, you know, he had to come out with all these stories about he couldn't remember what it felt like to walk on the moon and stuff. But I've looked at the pictures. There's one picture of this so-called shard, which even Hoagland admits is, you know, it's highly zoomed in, contrast enhanced, tweaked, sharpened, all the rest of it. And you see like this star in it. I can't remember if I've reproduced this in the book, but basically my conclusion, I couldn't see any evidence of glass domes. I couldn't see any evidence of this shard that Hoagland talks about.
And I think we need to draw a distinction between surface images that have been taken by Apollo missions, which you would say are studio images, and orbiter images. So,
Absolutely.
So we need to say which is which.
That's right.
Because you believe they're taken from different places.
Yes, I mean, to me, the Apollo mission images are from a studio, or that even if they, you know, there's two different things. Not only did they not land on the moon, they didn't orbit the moon with men. You know, I'm quite happy that they got unmanned probes to go around the moon and photograph the dark side and everything, but I can't see how they would have managed to get men to or even orbit the moon. So Apollo 10, that never orbited the moon. That was stayed in low Earth orbit. So any image that you see, say taken from Apollo 8 or taken from Apollo 10 or whatever, I wouldn't accept those myself as legitimate images. Right. Apollo 8 onwards, I'd say any images from those of the moon, forget it.
So do you think it's possible that someone is using Hoagland to explain away telling signs of a studio set as far out claims that no one would ever believe?
Yeah, I think that's probably how it's worked. There's this other guy called Ken Johnston who has worked with Hoagland, and he claims to be a NASA whistleblower, and he also claims to have got high resolution images from NASA's archives because he worked there for a period of time. And he's backed up Hoagland on this talk of the shard and stuff. And I basically, he contacted me on Facebook. This was about 6 months ago, and he said, "Oh, I'm doing a podcast on these lunar anomalies, you know." And I said, and he sent me a link, and I said, "Those are all Apollo images, you know. That I don't agree that they're authentic."
Right.
And he just didn't even respond.
Right.
He didn't try and persuade me. He didn't argue with me. You know, I just thought it was really strange that he would contact me.
Right.
You know.
And you know, we have covered Apollo quite a lot on Rich Planet, so people can look at these other programs if they want to look at any evidence of what you're saying.
Absolutely.
What about colours, Andrew? Because some people say that the colour of the moon changes, and do we see the correct colour reflected by the sun? Is it, or
yeah, I mean, obviously, when you're seeing it with your own eyes, you know, the only real influence you have on the colour is the amount of the atmosphere that you're looking through. So in other words, if you're seeing the moon when it's low in the sky, you're looking through more of the atmosphere. So it hasn't. So if you're looking at the moon from the Earth and it's low in the sky, when you're looking at it from the Earth and you're looking towards the horizon, you know by experience it tends to be more orangey. in colour. And when it gets higher in the sky, it's much whiter, isn't it? And it becomes sort of white in appearance. And that's because obviously the atmosphere that diffracts the blue light and leaves you with the red. So again, the colour of the moon, we see it from the Earth, it looks orangey when it's low down, but once we see it's basically colourless. It's grey and white as we see it in the night sky. So that's an accurate coloration. And most of the photographs that we see do reflect that.
And what about George Adamski claims of there being an atmosphere on the moon? And I've heard other people say they think there's atmosphere or parts of the moon, and you can breathe on parts of the moon. You wouldn't.
Well, I'm not so sure, because I mean it's one thing to say that we can't see when we can't see any atmosphere. We can see directly down to the moon's surface. I think that's pretty clear, and you can see that with a good telescope. You can see the features and whatnot. But there may be places where there's an atmosphere, a very thin atmosphere, or it may be very close to the ground, so that we can't actually see the effects of that thin atmosphere from the Earth. So because it's such a long way off, it's 200,000 miles away. There may be an atmosphere. Whether it's breathable, that's just speculation. So I don't know.
Right.
But you can see that the colours don't seem to indicate that it's got a thick atmosphere. We'll say that much.
So with regards to conclusions on the moon, then, you're very open-minded on whether there may be ancient artifacts from other races, and you're open-minded on whether there's live bases that have been put there in recent times. So you're totally open on that.
Yes.
You think that's entirely possible.
I do.
But you don't think there's evidence that we can say...
Not in the open. Not in the open. And I think there's been some disinformation put out to cover things up. There's certainly one example where John Lear claims that there was a base on this photograph and it's been airbrushed out. And I looked at that closely, and I couldn't say he was right. I couldn't say he was wrong either, because I hadn't necessarily seen the original images that he claimed to have seen.
Yeah, because doesn't John Lear claim that when they first put out the orbiter images, the first batch or the earlier batches were in higher resolution than you can get now, and he's got the earlier ones where they haven't airbrushed out the anomalies as well? Am I right there?
It's something like that. I forget what his full account is, but it's something along those lines. But certainly with the LRO images, if the ones that I've looked at from him, if they've airbrushed stuff out, they've certainly done a good job, because I couldn't see anything obvious. I mean, I'm not a total expert in image analysis, but I couldn't see any evidence of any structures on the images on the moon that I've looked at. And I looked at a few more, and I looked at them more closely while I was doing this book.
It would be nice to see a website with all of the earliest images from the lunar orbiters that they published digitized, so that you can go and see that. Someone who managed to get the very earliest lunar orbiter images, if there's anyone out there, you'd be happy to see that. If someone had them in a draw, what year are we talking about? When would they have put those out?
It would have been sort of mid-60s, really, 66, 67.
Right, so this is way before the internet, right?
Yeah.
And would they be in negative form?
The way that they came down, and there's an explanation of this, in that they actually were the film was developed inside the probe, and then they had some type of modulation technique to beam it down by radio. So what they got, it wasn't a negative; it was actually a radio signal.
Right.
And you can see some of the scan lines on these earlier images because of the way it was scanned.
But we'd be interested in anyone who happens to have some of the very early images that were published by NASA of the moon that are perhaps different now.